Abraham Lincoln's first compared to his second inaugural address. Before we get started, let's review some important terms. An inauguration is a ceremony for the swearing in of the President of the United States that marks the beginning of their new term. A newly sworn-in president is like having them inducted. The president then gives a speech called an inaugural address. The inaugural address is where the new president shares his or her vision for the nation. Take a look at the timeline provided. You will see that Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address was on March 4th, 1861, followed by, in the next couple years, the Emancipation Proclamation and his Gettysburg Address in the year 1863. But you'll notice that exactly 4 years later, on March 4th, 1865, he has given his second inaugural address. Specifically today, we're going to focus on breaking down the differences between Abraham Lincoln's first and second inaugural address. First, we are going to start with Lincoln's view on the role of slavery within the Civil War. As we take a look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, we can see that he states, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended." And in his second inaugural address, it seems as though his tone has changed ever so slightly. He states, "1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not over the Union, but in the southern part of it. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war. Neither anticipated the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease." Think about the language that was used by Abraham Lincoln in both inaugural addresses about slavery. Think about how he felt in the first inaugural address that we went over, and now think about what you think he is trying to say in the second inaugural address. To further explain or dissect this, let's go ahead and take a look at some explanations of each. In the first inaugural address, Lincoln repeatedly claims that his purpose is not to end slavery, but that he is opposed only to the extension or the spread of slavery. He says that he has no purpose to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. His purpose is to prevent the spread of slavery, not to free the slaves. He places major emphasis on the fact that the conflict is about whether or not to allow the spread of slavery. But you'll see his tone and his words of choice are slightly different in the second inaugural address. Many in the South were still maintaining that the cause of the Civil War was not slavery at all, but rather states' rights against the government. But in his second inaugural address, Lincoln leaves us with nothing to be confused about, and he makes it known very well that it's about slavery. Since his first inaugural address, Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation, his most significant executive order, which granted freedom to slaves in rebellious states. In his second address, Lincoln does not speak to prevent the spread of slavery, but to the fact that slavery has been ended. Now, let's take a look at Lincoln's purpose for the addresses. In the first inaugural address, he states, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." And in his second inaugural address, his tone once again is slightly different. He states, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So if we go back and dissect the two inaugural addresses, we will see that in Lincoln's first inaugural address, that his purpose was to try to avoid the impending war and to keep the Union together. In his first address, Lincoln attempts to portray the South as the aggressive people, the side that starts the hostilities, and indeed, the South starts the war by attacking Fort Sumter. In his second inaugural address, we see that he begins to talk about the fact that neither side thought the war would be as long or as bloody as it was. In this address, he switches to a tone of healing and a return to peace. He stresses that there should be no ill will toward either side and that goodwill should be extended to all. Hopefully, this brief analysis will allow you to be able to reflect on both of Lincoln's inaugural addresses. As you continue to further look into these documents, I want you to think about these two questions. The first, how is Lincoln's first inaugural address different from his second inaugural address? Think about the text evidence that you can use from both passages to support your answer. Lastly, think to yourself, why was it so important for Lincoln to preserve the Union? As we conclude our study of Abraham Lincoln's speeches during the American Civil War, I want you to reflect on the principles we can carry forward to better ourselves as a nation today.